The communist parties, which were very small in all these eastern states of Europe, have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. Police governments are prevailing in nearly every case, and so far, except in Czechoslovakia, there is no true democracy.
CQ from Citizen Number 6, reporting to you from a forward observation post. Over the past couple of years, socialism has made inroads into the United States. The millennials in particular seem to have taken a fancy to it. Perhaps this is no accident, as the people who witnessed textbook socialism firsthand and could warn society are quickly vanishing into history. The greatest generation who fought in World War II are almost all over the age of 90 at this point. The best way to understand socialism is to consider its objective, its underlying values, and the strategies used to accomplish this objective. First and foremost, socialism aims to gear economic production towards meeting everyone's needs so that no one is left behind. For instance, Karl Marx popularized the catchphrase, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Because everyone should get their needs met, this lends itself naturally to the idea of benevolence. Instead of exploiting people, you take care of them. Likewise, if everyone's needs are going to be met, it implies that everyone is equal and equally valued by society, which in the political sphere maps neatly to democracy, where everyone gets to have a voice with regard to policy making. These values drive two basic strategies. The first is called social ownership, which involves public ownership of industrial equipment, factories, land, things that are often referred to in aggregate as the means of production. The second strategy is to implement a bottom-up management structure that has a relatively flat hierarchy. It's known as worker management. So let's explore the playbook, which has been used by revolutionary socialists to meet their primary goal, to leave no one behind. In practice, the goal of meeting everyone's needs is addressed by centralizing authority into a monolithic bureaucracy. This bureaucratic machine is controlled by a single political party, which usually holds a strict monopoly on power. No other organizations are allowed to challenge it, much less exist. This is one reason why socialists tend to frown on religion, because it offers an alternative organizational base. The monolithic bureaucratic machine is used by party leadership to impose equality in a manner that favors collaboration over competition. To this end, the government confiscates private assets and spends a lot of effort explaining to people why that's the right thing to do. Everyone is then cataloged and registered so that it can receive rations of the basic necessities. On paper, socialism comes across as having good intentions. Society makes sure that no one gets left behind, using a framework that's aimed at minimizing cruelty, as well as promoting equality and democracy, with the long-term goal of building a utopian society, a state of affairs which socialists refer to as communism. History informs, however, that textbook socialism has almost always been an unmitigated disaster, a pointless exercise in oppression and suffering. In other words, it's an Orwellian nightmare. For example, in the 1970s, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, who had substantial backing from communist China, launched a socialist revolution in Cambodia. The genocide which followed killed approximately a quarter of Cambodia's population, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. And Cambodia wasn't an anomaly. All of the large-scale socialist revolutions of the past century were absolute bloodbaths. Russia, China, North Korea, they all relied heavily on brutal police state methods: labor camps, starvation, forced disappearances, executions, torture. One researcher at Princeton calculated that at least 65 million people have been killed by communists over the last century. This figure is comparable to the number of people killed during World War II. All of this death and misery, that's hardly what you'd call meeting people's needs or being benevolent. In fact, it brings into question the underpinnings of socialism as a whole, its stated goal, its values, its strategies. Because if the core design is flawed and not based in reality, it's only logical that what happens in practice will likewise have serious problems. For example, consider the emphasis that socialists place on equality. In theory, the organizing principle of socialism is equality, a flat hierarchy. But strictly speaking, people aren't all the same. That's why the distribution of IQ scores is bell-shaped. There's a whole range of possible values, with most people scoring within a standard deviation of the average, and smaller groups of people further out. The cognitively disabled at the low end, and the gifted at the other. In 2010, scientists ranked the national IQs of 108 countries. Northeast Asia and European countries were at the top. Clearly, not everyone is the same. In fact, if you follow any competitive activity, this inherent inequality becomes unmistakable. After all, there is only one world chess champion, and his name is Magnus Carlsen. Magnus is from Norway, and sure enough, Norway is listed in the top 10 nations as far as IQ scores are concerned. Kurt Vonnegut poked fun at socialists and their fetish for equality in a short story entitled Harrison Bergeron, which appeared in his anthology, Welcome to the Monkey House. In his story, Vonnegut envisions a society in which equality is imposed at gunpoint by forcing everyone to the least common denominator. The year is 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. Which is really saying something considering what happens to Russian women as they get older. Socialists will counter that they don't believe in equality of condition. Rather, they promote equality of opportunity and access to resources. On a deeper level, however, as I mentioned earlier, mandating equality across a society requires extensive government intervention. This is one of the major design flaws of socialism. By consolidating authority under a small group of bureaucrats, you set the stage for a police state. Abuse is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. For example, President Xi in China was proclaimed leader for life in 2018. In other words, he's got the sort of power that the world hasn't seen since the Dark Ages. With this power, Xi has turned the entire region of Xinjiang, with its population of over 20 million, into the world's largest open-air prison. The methods that China is using in Xinjiang are spreading to all the other major cities in China. Biometrics, smartphone monitoring, internet traffic aggregation, it's all being merged together to control people on an unprecedented level. Let's just say that there's a good reason why millions of people in Hong Kong are terrified about the security law that China just passed. China's neighbor to the east, North Korea, is another socialist regime, and it's a case study in leftist authoritarianism. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, is a third-generation dictator who rules by terror. As you might expect, he tolerates zero dissent, even from members of his own inner circle. In fact, he's been known to execute high-ranking officials with anti-aircraft guns and then incinerate their cadavers with flamethrowers. In 2017, Kim had his half-brother assassinated in public with a military-grade chemical weapon just to make sure people knew who was responsible. The lesson is this: socialism tends towards autocracy. And once that freedom's gone, it's extremely difficult to get back. Returning to the socialist playbook that we saw earlier, with its monolithic bureaucracy, there are severe pitfalls with the methods used to impose equality and cooperation. Consider redistribution. It's typically driven by a victimization narrative, where lack of success in life is portrayed as the result of oppression, which is inevitably the fault of someone else. And as a result, that someone else owes something and has to fork it over. This narrative is effective because it's always easier to blame someone else for your problems than it is to own your life and take responsibility for it. The truth is that the victimization narrative robs people of agency. And it does so by retreating to convenient talking points that externalize blame and discourage self-improvement. And all of this creates the impression of entitlement. In practice, redistribution is fairly straightforward. It's a form of property theft that's couched in moral language. You start by indexing everyone in a directory. Then you single out the successful people and seize their property. People like Tim Cook, or Warren Buffett, or Jim Hackett, the business leaders who get work done. The government then rations those assets out to everyone else. The people who had their assets seized or who show any sign of resistance are typically carted off to labor camps, and that process is politely referred to as re-education. Another problem with redistribution is that it sets up a flawed incentive structure. It punishes people who had the discipline and initiative to be successful, and it rewards people who make bad decisions and who therefore aren't successful. Why go out and accomplish anything when you could just sit in your basement and play computer games all day long? Every slacker's fantasy to just sit around and be a sponge. Socialist redistribution also undermines quality control mechanisms that normally exist in society. It allows people who make bad decisions to keep on making bad decisions. This creates a feedback loop that grows bigger and bigger. When you facilitate bad behavior, you're going to get more of it. The movie Idiocracy takes a satirical look at this dynamic. With no quality control in place, stupid people reproduce in higher numbers, thus lowering the collective IQ of the human race over time. With no natural predators to thin out the herd, evolution, began to simply reward those who reproduce the most and left the intelligent to become an endangered species. It's the electrolytes. The end result is that no one has an incentive to do anything productive. Without the possibility of failure, there can be no success. This means low economic growth. It also translates into stagnation, because nobody bothers to invent anything. And as you might expect, the standard of living decreases to what you'd normally associate with a communist country. There's an old communist saying from the Cold War, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay." Remember how all this started, trying to meet people's needs under the auspices of benevolence, equality, and democracy. In doing so, the public record shows that socialism creates police states, run by despots who enslave and subjugate by stealing private property and justifying it using emotionally potent propaganda and brutally oppressing what little opposition remains. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this is particularly true with regard to socialism. Which brings in mind that old chestnut from Benjamin Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And so I thank you for your attention. From a forward observation post, this is Citizen number 6.